Could you imagine being a sea sponge and just some alien yanks you out of the water and you ask, "What divine purpose do you want me for, God?" And that person just says, "Communal butt sponge." Okay, so right before I started trying to film this video, I saw on the news that a lion escaped from an Italian zoo, and I just thought that was so befitting. Hope you're having a wonderful day. My name is Zelina Hall. I'm a singer-songwriter musician. This is one of the first times I've done something like this. I usually do music stuff. I've broken the world record for the most consecutively released singles. As I'm recording this, I have done 61 songs. I've released a single every single Friday. So, yeah, that's a lot. Let's do the thing, shall we? Was life better in ancient Rome? So there's like a lot of discussion about ancient Rome, and everybody's like, "Oh my god, ancient Rome's so cool." But, you know, it's credited as the inspiration for the American government, as well as Athens was accredited for being a major inspiration for modern day governments. But let's just see how much, shall we? Bits of ancient Rome are usually taken out of context. They're like, "Oh, this great thing," or "this great piece of art," or this, that, and the other. But it doesn't really paint a full picture. I got notes here, so if you're wondering why I'm going back and forth, there you go. But I'll also be looking at this from like a citizen's perspective of what can happen to a Roman citizen. So I'm not going to touch on everything because that would be impossible in a lighthearted fashion. So Rome is constantly romanticized, and let's see if it lives up to the hype. It's probably not much better than living in the Dark Ages of Europe, tell you the truth. The Dark Ages weren't that bad, but Rome wasn't that great. It's like being drafted into the Vietnam War for the average dude. You could be, all the time. Explain this with some background, shall we? So, Rome was rural, populated by native Romans. I mean, of course, they're Romans. Oh my god. It was conquered around 650 to 600 BCE. There's a lot of debates on the specifics, but, like, it isn't particularly relevant. Might have said that wrong. But you can tell from the dates and the myths of children being raised by wolves and then raised by a shepherd, and then that somebody got a little too creative with the timelines here. Someone got a little too creative. A little too much ayahuasca. Besides of all this insanity, what was clear were the Etruscans. They founded Rome, at least, you know, built Rome from being rural poverty to empire status. Rome was founded, yeah, of course, because of its natural resources and location. I mean, there was a salt work, which was apparently a pretty big deal back in the day. Woohoo! I bet they would have had an aneurysm if they found out about pink Himalayan sea salt. Like, could you imagine that? Like, seeing the lamp and then just like, "It is glowing. Is it a ghost?" After seeing a glass door for the first time and going into a wellness store, you'd probably see them build up an army and raid the place. "Take the glass! Take the pills!" They shove up their ass! Anyway, going from living under tents, like in rocks, like, I'm sorry, I'm getting my notes. Goodness gracious, notes, please. Anything would seem like an improvement after that. I mean, quite honestly. Rome was slowly built into a city-state with great infrastructure. This is not infrastructure. The Etruscans planned and created sanitation systems. Yippee! And everything else, like roads, vaulted ceilings, everything you associate with the Roman Empire, just about every single advancement they had, it was actually the Etruscans. Woo! This is kind of like a trend for Roman Empire, Rome, Republic, Roman everything, is that they just see something and they just import it in. It's like the cheap plastic goods of today. Everything comes from somewhere else. By the way, the Etruscans kind of just came out of nowhere, and like nobody really knows where they came from. They just kind of exist. And there's like tons of guesses, and everybody's just throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing if it's done. So they just kind of kept on keeping on for thousands of years after their best by date, just kind of like Twinkies, you know? Befitting. Rome did have toilets, of course. Idea of like a communal butt sponge. Like, I mean, God. I mean, who wants to shove this up their butt? Like, I wonder if they like drew straws and like the shortest person had to use it last. Just a thought. Also, historians like keep doing what historians do and like argue whether public toilets had stalls or not. So they're like can't see where the wood is. So I saw that in the news the other day. That's just like a fun little thing. Like you might have been crapping beside someone, or you might have not. You might have had a barrier, but who knows? Most drawings are like, yep, we crapping in the open, boys. I mean, you'd probably be the talk of town if you blew a toilet up. I mean, hey, did you hear Chloe? I guess she's lactose intolerant. I mean, after all. Heck, the wealthy guys might have had it worse. The rich dudes have to go over a cesspit, like, well, I mean, you either crap in front of everybody else with flushing water using a communal butt sponge, or you have a private butt sponge, but you have to poop over an open cesspit or use a chamber pot. I think a lot of people chose the communal option. Maybe bring your own sponge day. Hey, I actually knew someone who used the outhouse one time, and it started shaking while they were in it, and they were like, what's happening? They looked down in the hole, and there's pigs. Just let that sink in for a moment. Even with all the achievements from the Etruscans, the rule didn't come without negative consequences, because of course there's always negative consequences. Yay, me! Many of the various Etruscan kings were like, warlike. Yeah, of course. So they kind of looked constantly stirring the pot, constantly expanding their empire, and they invaded every patch of green because guess what? That means they're serious. So the kings were more tyrannical than others. But not a lot is known about this period. Of course, yeah, everything gets lost in history. Just like the artists' names, great. However, in any monarchy, there's bound to be severe issues. Side note, apparently a punishment for a crime could be being thrown off a cliff. So, the Romans, they never did anything halfway. They did everything full way. Just like the orgies. It gets worse later on. This gets way worse later on. Rome's aristocracy led a revolt around 509 BCE. Of course, there's argument around that date too, because everything's an argument back then. And they overthrew the Etruscans. And let's just say there were severe issues between Rome and the Etruscans and everybody that's allied with the Etruscans and everybody that was ruled by the Etruscans. And like, oh my God, Rome was in war constantly because, oh, guess what? Rome was either defending itself or attacking. Greece was relatively peaceful in comparison by far, even though the Spartans kept perpetually declaring war every year against their helots. And yet these dudes, like, I mean, good God, the Latin world was a burning carapace of a Ghost Rider-esque honey badger. Yeah, cue Vietnam War reference here. So, here's a quote. Men from the age of 16 to 46 were eligible to be drafted into the army. Each soldier had to provide and maintain his own equipment. So, Wasson, 2021. So, basically, your equipment would have been only as good as your bank account. So, if you poor, you dead. God. So, the conscriptions were long and brutal, because of course they were. Nothing was ever halfway in the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. Why peace? We can just throw bodies at the problem. Lord of the Rings on cocaine. That's pretty much what... They actually did have a war with elephants. So... I think it was the Second Punic War. Hannibal came in with elephants. It was like, time to die, Rome! There's like a lot of dispute about this. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I've seen reports of like dudes cutting off their thumbs to like avoid conscription. But it doesn't, for Rome, it doesn't surprise me because you look at the modern day things, people trying to dodge the draft in like freaking different countries across the world, and you're like, wow, they're breaking their arms and stuff. Does not surprise me. I also saw other sources talking about people actually going into the gladiator pits and registering as a gladiator instead of going into war, because that was better. You could be sold into slavery for dodging the draft. You could be burned at the stake for dodging the draft. You could be all sorts of bad things done to you because you dodged the draft, no matter if you were aristocracy or not. Told you it was gonna get bad, but it gets worse. It gets worse. You could be executed by higher-ups for many different reasons. You know, your higher-up just says, you did a terrible job today. I guess it's time to take you off the census. So, some commanders were like, I live by my men, and my men live by me. Didn't have a peacetime. It was like, it was on crack. It was just on timing like that. Like, now we're getting a little serious and terrifying. By the way, this is not a used communal butt sponge. So, that's why I'm getting handsy with it. So another thing to worry about that was quite common for the poor citizens was for poor citizens, of course, because they're poor, to sell their kids into slavery. And they also could take their children off the census, so I guess... I mean, I told you it was gonna get worse. I mean... Imagine disappointing your parents so bad, the next thing, they're like, either we gotta pay our loans off, boy, or then go off, get out the sword, get out the guillotine, Jimmy did too many a crime yesterday. It's haunting. Like, it's just haunting. I mean, God. So, enslaved peoples existed in a wide range of what we consider white-collar to stereotypical servant jobs. So they would do housework, mining, that kind of stuff. The mining was the worst thing you could do. The gladiatorial pits were actually better than the mining. By God, that's terrifying. At least depending on who you were. However, Romans depended on them so much, having, enslaved people, that there were stories of masters not being able to bathe without their servants' help. Like, imagine bathe. Like, so very rich Romans were literally incapable of basic human functions without the help of their servants. So they were all whiny babies. All the rich were whiny babies. So I guess the upper crust have always been parasites in society, sucking us dry slowly as we turn into a nothing but a husk of what we once were. Also, during my research, masters often had very bizarre attachments to their slave servants, and many of them fell in love with their slave servants, even in front of their wives. So yeah, divorce rates in ancient Rome were insane. There was also arguments about whether slavery was right or not, and there was one theorist that was like, slavery is fine, but we should have a code of conduct that all slaves should have rights. Like, how do you just say that? Like, yeah, it's fine, but I agree with the rights part, but I don't think there should be, people forced. So, yeah. Romans were really weird in the most literal sense of the weirdness you could possibly be. They were like the weirdness of the weirdness of the weirdness. There was like, I mean, so slaves back on the slave topic, oh god. They didn't have any rights, period, so that's why there was arguments for their rights. The Senate didn't really care if they had rights or not. That's why no rights were passed, because the Senate was like the wealthy people that owned the most people. Wasn't really in their interest. But there was like, it was actually pretty common for masters to be like, you were a good person, let's free you, or servants buying their way out of servitude, especially if they were like white collar servants. I've seen sources say that like 10 to 20% of the whole Roman Republic / Empire were slaves, so the population was huge. In like the city of Rome, it was either a 3-to-1 ratio or like a 2-to-1 ratio later on. So that's a lot. So the city of Rome, the capital of oppression. Since there was so many educated enslaved peoples, like even freaking accountants and stuff, like god, they could just blend in sometimes, and some people were reported to just disappear in the Roman Empire if they were able to eventually get out. But they often made a lot of slaves wear dog collars locked onto their necks. By the way, one dark note, or light note, I read up on the demographics of ancient Rome, and let's just say most slaves were white, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of reading on this, so if you want to know more, you can. It's down there in the description. Actually, most of the Roman slaves were their fellow Latins that they took lands from. I need to put this down. I need to put it down. A huge side note, in my research, I did run across many instances of specifically years and years into the later years of the Roman civilization, that the lines between poor and slaves kind of like completely blurred into oblivion. And so the life of a free poor citizen was so similar to that of a slave that at some point the distinction between the two just kind of like disappeared. So besides the obvious issues with with the ancient Rome, with the Roman Empire and public, and I said public, not like republic. There are other systemic factors, because of course there is. And also a lot of these factors are modern day problems. When I did research on ancient Rome, I realized that a lot of the problems we have now, we had way back then too. Almost. But I'm just cherry picking here and showing you some, but like, you read up on it, you're like, wow, okay, god, Rome was brutal, so, because of course we didn't learn from history, I mean, come on, so the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, so if you thought you could escape your worries, no, so it's not the case here. Many of the issues of wealth and income inequality were alive and well and kicking and crying during the Roman Republic and Empire. I mean, if your government was founded by wealthy toga-wearing hedonists, you should expect some stuff to be a little iffy. There was a huge class struggle between the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and I said that wrong, didn't I? Which were the aristocracy were the patricians, everybody else were the plebeians, which were like the free peoples that were poor. Plebeians, that's where the word pleb comes from. You're just such a pleb. Pleb, blah, 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 blah. Originally, the Republic only had say by the wealthy, and then everybody started protesting for like a few hundred years or whatever, and then the wealthy were like, okay, we'll give the poor a little bit of power, just a little bit. So it was mostly ran by an oligopoly So it looked like a republic on the surface, but it truly was never a republic. It just sucked. It was an oligopoly. They had 2 councils at the top of state, and they were elected by the Senate. We love bureaucracy, don't we? But especially bureaucracy that isn't you directly elected by the people. A lot of the territories that Rome conquered didn't have the right to vote, period. And so that kind of caused a lot of issues. It's kind of like really American. I mean, you think of the Puerto Rico thing, if you think of anything like that, that's a super American issue right there. I guess we really were inspired by them. Mm-hmm. So many reformists tried to come in, getting more rights for people. However, a lot of them were executed by the Senate. Like, a lot of them. Like, a lot of them. There were like 2 brothers that went up there. One was executed first, and the other one a few years later after he tried to do the same thing. So, yeah. So women were not afforded the same rights as men, so it was no paradise for dudes, being conscripted and dead and gladiatorial arena and slaves and poor. But it was not a candy shop for women either. A little bit worse for women. They didn't have the same rights as men. They weren't allowed to vote, but they were still considered citizens if they were like born of a Roman citizen. They were Roman citizens, so they had some rights, but not nearly as much as men. I mean, children had no rights. If you were a child in ancient Rome, you were completely like... So apparently the men were afraid of the women. There was like several scholars that are like, women will take over Rome if we give them any power. We're all gonna die. So yeah, apparently that's a funny thing when you read a lot of like Roman literature and your stuff and you realize, God, you are terrified of something that is like, if you met Spartan women, I guess you would be terrified. So, women were allowed to get private education if the parents were wealthy and they could pay for it. I mean, the public education for boys was okay. It wasn't really that great. If you were a poor boy, you only got a little bit, like a little bit. If you're a rich boy, then you got a lot. And you could get enough to like be able to have a successful life. So yeah, it was built-in equality from the start. So women were allowed to own businesses and stuff and have their own personal finances, and they didn't necessarily have to give up their financial assets in a marriage if they didn't want to. So there was different types of marriage that a woman could do. She could give up her assets to her husband. She could keep them for herself. She was also allowed to inherit property. Like later on in the Roman Empire, it was enshrined that a woman could own property, even though in practice there were women that owned property still. It was just enshrined later on. So being a woman wasn't necessarily as bad as some societies. Like, I mean, it's not like modern day Afghanistan, am I right? But women were kind of expected to just weave all the time. Just sit there and weave. Weave clothing, make clothing, like just like, because the slaves did everything else. So it was for some godforsaken reason. They're like, oh, just make clothing. Spend your entire life making clothing. So they also wanted women to have children, but not for the reason you think. Not for like, oh, we need a population. It was more like, yeah, we need women to have children so their children can worship our family gods. Because if a woman does not have kids, therefore the family gods will go unworshipped, and that is bad. So little Timmy gotta be there to pray so he can get demons away. So I guess all their family gods are gone now, so I guess who cares now? I mean, I guess they didn't think that through. Oh well. So maybe they should have introduced a school of nihilism to ancient Rome. By the way, women in the upper crust of society often got a lot of sway. I mean, like one time, I think it was Emperor Augustus. He left in pursuit of his assassins. I'm not sure if it was Augustus or someone else. And he was like, hey, wife, yeah, you're in charge of the Roman Empire for a very long time while I'm getting these assassins. Okay, great. I get to take a break. So, yeah, women, so it's power of the V, I gotta say. So women took the feminine version of their father's name, which was a little weird of size. So it was like Julia Major, Julia Minor, and all that. So all the girls were named after their father. Didn't necessarily have to be the case, but most of the time it was the case, at least, when I'm seeing in the upper crusts. But there was a lot of women that also did get educations and had a lot of political power inadvertently. Because, everybody had to have political power inadvertently in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, because the Senate was always white dudes just like wearing togas and stuff. So rights increased over time, but also the brutality of crime and punishment increased over time. Also, on a side note, marriage was banned for a little while during the Roman Empire, and straight marriage was banned for a little while. So the straights were not okay. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was just some of the weird and horrible and horrific things that you could have contended with during the Roman Republic and Empire. So if you fancy using a communal toilet sponge, butt sponge, or bathing in public spaces, ancient Rome is the place for you if you wish to use the sacred poop loofah. But if you, like me, would rather not have to use a butt sponge, communal butt, I would be rather born now. You don't want to be born into a society where you could get thrown into the gladiatorial pits, regardless of gender, by the way. There are women gladiators too. Let's stick to the modern day, shall we? Okay, sorry, I horribly did this transition. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for watching, and please check out my music if you like this, and share this and all that jazz and jizz. Boop. And if you like this video, I'll do more.